All right, thank you everybody for attending today. My name is Justin Buchanan. I'm a senior director at Cisco. I'd like to thank everybody for coming out. I do my typical public service announcement every time I present in Vegas. I always tell people these casinos weren't built on winners, so please don't gamble too much, but do take advantage of the free drinks, whether they be alcoholic or non-alcoholic. So. Yeah, and I hope everyone had a great Thanksgiving as well, and it's good to be back. So today, we are going to talk about application first security, and so, in combination to, you may have seen my bio, I run the secure workload business at Cisco, as well as secure firewall business, and so two businesses that really, what we're trying to do is to protect not only users, but also applications. And I'll give you an overview of what we're seeing out there, some of the trends that we're seeing, some of the things we're seeing ultimately from customers, and then give you some insight into how we're ultimately going to secure applications moving forward. And if I can get the clicker to work here, that's basically the same slide. So again, we'll talk about a few things. The rapid expansion of the network, how COVID has certainly accelerated a number of things. We'll talk about the perimeter. Where's my perimeter? Actually, the product marketing manager I have, he's from Santa Cruz. I think what he meant to say is, dude, where's my perimeter? But we'll talk about that. How do we flip the model in terms of looking at applications, securing these applications, versus potentially securing the network or securing the user? Not that they're all not important, but securing the applications is certainly critical as we move more applications from these private data centers into the cloud. That's what we'll talk about in microsegmentation. I'll give you a preview of what we're doing from a user perspective. Everything that we'll talk about really up into microsegmentation are things that we have on the truck today at Cisco. When we look at the users, these are really things that will be, you'll see more from us over the next 6 to 9 months. And then last but not least, the reason I'm speaking today is we are announcing an integration with our secure firewall with AWS Control Tower, and so we'll talk about that towards the end. Business success depends on secure, connected experience, and so I like to talk about, right, doesn't matter where you are, if you're at home, if you're in the office, if you're in a coffee shop, right, our perspective, what we want to make sure is that you are secure as a user, and that as you access applications, those applications are secure. And the success of all businesses really depends on that. I was looking at a recent study, and they, every year they talk about how much a breach costs. I believe the average breach worldwide is about $1.5 million. I think in the US, it's actually around $10 million. So there's a lot more money to be made by hacking into US corporations. But again, every year the price goes up. And so understanding and making sure that we're secure is certainly critical. We tend to look at a couple of different things in terms of how we secure the network, but there are new challenges, right? And these new challenges don't ultimately lend themselves well to the old ways of security, right? Hybrid access, the perimeter is gone. We'll talk about the perimeter here coming up. Distributed perimeters, distributed applications, distributed users, how do we secure those? Old security ways, visibility and control are not always there, right? We'll talk about the rise in encrypted traffic. We see customers that don't encrypt any traffic. We see some larger financial institutions that want to decrypt all the traffic, right? So it really depends on where the organizations are. But what we do know for sure is that encryption is increasing, and ways to either look at encrypted traffic and or decrypt are going to be important moving forward. The rates of change, right? Containers, applications. Again, was talking to a colleague of mine, and he said one of his biggest fears is a developer with a credit card, right? They can go on, they can get onto AWS, they can spin up a new container in their environment very quickly, and when the NetSec operators wake up every morning, they're trying to figure out what's going on out there, right? And so how do we look at all of that, and quite frankly, how do we make sure that we're being effective in security as these applications and quite frankly, as users change? So we've been talking to a lot of customers recently, and what we've seen, and everyone here, we're at the AWS conference, right? So 82% of IT leaders have adopted hybrid cloud. Surveys that I've seen, I would say it's around 90% of folks, right, are in the cloud today. Obviously, everyone here is close to getting into the cloud. And then about 47%, or about half of those, are also in 2 clouds, right? And so securing in AWS, we partner very closely with them. That's one thing. There's certainly other cloud providers out there partnering with them. It's a different animal, right? And so not only are we moving these applications into clouds, but then there's multiple clouds, and securing those is a challenge. That said, the users still demand connectivity, right? Doesn't matter where those apps are, where they live. How do we make sure that those applications are secure? If we look at layer 3, layer 4, again, all that remains in the cloud. And if it's data applications and users, anywhere is ultimately connected by a network. All right, we'll move into dude, where's my perimeter? So this slide I'd like to talk about in terms of traditional networks, right? And so maybe 10 years ago, maybe 8 years ago, we saw security, not that it was simpler, but it was simpler, right? We had a number of users that sat in a corporate environment. They sat behind this firewall. We had a single firewall that protected us from, right, the big bad internet. This has changed. It's changed for a number of reasons. I think it's accelerated, quite frankly, because of what we've seen with the pandemic. But we see multiple perimeters today, right? So we see branch offices, remote employees, vendors, contractors, personal devices. All of these, right, are different perimeters. And one of the things that we look at, especially at Cisco, is how do we take security and move it closer to these perimeters, right? Whether these perimeters be individual users or applications, we want to make sure that we're providing security as close to those perimeters as we can. And we want to make sure that we can regain control, right, of these perimeters and access applications, and especially when this data is more and more distributed. Finally, how do we evolve to make sure our applications are being protected first and, quite frankly, foremost? So we're bringing it together, right? And what we're doing is we're evolving the security model. And so we're going to turn security network on its head with an application-first perspective. What we want to do is make sure that we look at the applications and the data, and we maintain visibility and control of both of those. Quite frankly, this is your last line of defense, and it should also be your first priority. All right. Traditionally, though, this is not what we've been doing, right? And in order to solve the cloud and distributed application problem, we've taken really more of a siloed and often linear approach to our focus. Users and device security, which gave rise to ZTNA. I was actually talking to a customer the other day. They said, as long as it's called ZTNA in our organization, it'll get funded, right? And so ZTNA is certainly an overused term, but one that, when we talk about users, we talk about ZTNA. Network security is limited to maintaining existing controls, and threat detection within the private infrastructure doesn't exist kind of as it used to. And a lot of this is because we talked about before in terms of encryption, right? And again, we used to be able to put traffic flows into a firewall, inspect those via an IPS, and permit or deny those flows. The rise of encryption has made it more difficult to do that. Last but not least, we'll look at how we can actually secure applications and data. What we need to do is bring these approaches together, right? And this is what we're looking to do really at Cisco. And it isn't an either or, right? Because all three of these are doing really great security. And when you look at these three buckets here, if you remember the perimeters, right? Users and devices, right? This is the person at the coffee shop. Network security, this is really your campus, potentially even part of your cloud. And ultimately application data, right? And so that resides in private and also public data centers. And they all provide value across what we're calling the access continuum. And working together, we can layer this protection and ultimately build resilience into how we secure the application and the data. User and device security, right? We talked about that. This is really around, how do we look at users? We look at the user posture. We look at where they're connecting from. Network and cloud. This is, again, firewall. From a Cisco perspective, we also do traffic analytics from a network perspective. And on the infra and data side, we'll talk about secure workload here coming up and what we can do to make sure that you can ultimately protect the applications and the data. And so we talked about flipping this model on its head and taking this application-first perspective because the last line of defense, again, as I mentioned, shouldn't be your first priority. This isn't to say that these perimeters aren't necessary. They definitely are. But by unifying the approach and in looking at application first, we're building security resilience into our architecture. And these components work both independently as well as together. We are layering our security and reducing risk while building in guardrails for compliance. And as I go through the presentation, I will talk about this intelligent policy engine that we're building out in Cisco. Because if we look today, really how users, what we call the NetSec operator, is looking at how they apply a policy, it's usually based on a user, right? It's user to app, not necessarily app to user. So we do like to start with the user, but understanding what our apps are, how our apps are secured, is critically important. All right, we're going to move into zero trust microsegmentation. This is a loaded term. I was talking about zero trust before, and how much of a loaded term it is. I like to take a step back, quite frankly, and talk about this more in terms of visibility and control, right? And so how do we get visibility into what applications are out there in the network? That's really the key first step, right? The second step is then moving to full microsegmentation, right? That's, to me, where we're applying policy and we're actually enforcing policy on these applications. And so, micros don't necessarily, for those of you that are looking into this, don't necessarily think that you have to get to microsegmentation out of the gate. You want to get to, and again, we'll talk about some different methods in which you can do that. But really what we want to get is visibility into what apps are there, what apps are coming onto the network, what apps have come off the network, and then start to apply these policies accordingly. And so what's driving the need for microsegmentation? This is a build slide here. Most people suffer from cyber attack fatigue. These are folks that are day to day looking at the security landscape. One of the other stats that I read was about 50% of folks or have had a cloud breach, right? So we have 58% saying they're tired of looking for breaches, and then we have another 50% that say they've been breached. And so this is an ongoing, constant battle that we have, right? Staying in front of these threat actors is definitely hard. Orchestration, 81%. Orchestration between products is challenging. We'll talk a little bit later in terms of what we're doing to bring that together. We'll also talk about some of the people challenges that we see in corporations. I think, I've been in this industry a long time. We like to call it layer 8. The layer 8 challenges are sometimes the most difficult, right? Even from a technology perspective, getting other teams, if you're looking, I haven't solved it, but it's difficult to do. And making and having tools that can at least apply policy holistically to network security controls is a good first step. 64% network security on the edge is more difficult. What is the edge? Good question, right? The edge is dispersed, the edge is ephemeral, the edge is constantly changing. Providing security is more difficult, quite frankly, than ever. 52% find it very extremely challenging to secure data in a public cloud. And this is not anything new. This is something that we've seen for a while. I think one of the challenges is certainly there's lots of products out there. There's lots of startups out there. There's lots of AWS have a number of products. So choosing the right product, making sure that it's right for your organization can be overwhelming and quite frankly, relatively difficult. Further, I like this slide, and I'll tell a story about one of our customers here, but 43% of organizations are releasing new changes weekly, and they want to actually do it more frequently, right? And then on the other side, right, 61% cite manual processes and siloed teams as bottlenecks for app delivery pipelines. And I'm sure if those of you that are doing this day to day, have this challenge. We were talking to a large pharmacy retailer. They have thousands of sites throughout the country. And they were saying that they have a bunch of developers, and they have a DevOps environment, right? So these developers are constantly spinning up new applications in this DevOps environment. Once the applications are production ready, they move them over into the production network. Now, once that happens, right, these applications are talking to different systems, and they were talking to potentially in the DevOps world. They need access to different parts of the network. And so it takes them about 2 weeks in a good day to be able to get those applications and the right policies over to those applications. And this is because of a number of things. And again, we'll talk about how we solve some of those challenges coming up. But it's mainly because of the fact that when these applications move, they're not aware of the access they need to give that application. And then once they do become aware, then they have to kick off the right level of trouble tickets, reviews, et cetera, policy pushes to make sure that application has the right access. Again, it's challenging, right? Distributed environments, complexity as these new applications come up, way beyond the human scale. I do not mention AI, ML in here, I don't think, but certainly something we could use it for in terms of the applications that are coming up. Integrating with DevOps tool chains. So this is another interesting point. I was talking to a former colleague of mine who joined a startup, and he was telling me that his startup basically, what they were trying to do was to put security controls earlier in that DevOps tool chain, right? Which I think is a great idea. But the problem was that the DevOps security folks couldn't actually buy his product, right? So they had to go to the security team to get and try to convince them that they could actually leverage this from a security perspective. And so what's the point of this story? So basically, the way that I look at it, there's two ways in which we can provide application security, right? The first way is we can build it into the DevOps tool chain. But again, this is somewhat difficult from a network security perspective for a number of reasons, quite frankly, probably cost. The other way is to do what the majority of the industry is doing today, and quite frankly, what we're doing, is to, once applications get into the network, understand what those applications are doing, build a holistic view of the communication path of that particular app, and then ultimately apply policy to that application. Two ways of doing it. I think the latter is probably the better way, but we are where we are in terms of looking at visibility, being able to sense traffic flows, and ultimately being able to apply policy. New and unfamiliar control points. This, again, right, technology keeps evolving. I have a slide here coming up. We'll talk about how it's evolved, which I'm sure everyone here is aware. But one of the things I will say, just in terms of security operators today, and certainly things that we face at Cisco and our customers face as well, as we bring new people in, by the time we get them trained up in terms of the technology, they move on, right? I'm not saying, I'm sure a lot of you have done this, I've done it myself, I'm not saying it's a bad thing, but I'm saying it's challenging for security organizations then to have talent that actually understands not only what's happening in the network, but then what's going to happen, right? And so any tools that we can have, any tools that we can provide within the network to make it easier and simpler and provide us more visibility are going to provide value very, very quickly. Technology evolution. I think most of us are aware of this, right? We've gone from virtual machines into cloud, and then ultimately into Kubernetes and now serverless. And so really over the last 3 decades, technology has evolved, right? We like to call it a tectonic shift. Started with bare metals, virtual machines, public clouds, and now we're looking at not only hybrid cloud, but also multi-cloud, right? And this large-scale adoption, maturing for containers and Kubernetes, again, has really dynamically shifted the landscape. This continues, right, with serverless that I talked about earlier, maturing very rapidly over the next few years, and we're certainly expecting to see large adoption on that as well. And really what this technology evolution did was to take customers away from paying an overhead and deployment and scaling their business and applications and moving these applications out into the cloud more quickly. And who knows what's coming after serverless? I'm old. I think I'm probably around the maturing containers piece in terms of my in-depth knowledge, but honestly, it's just going to keep going. So we'll talk a little bit about the organizational challenges. I talked about some of these earlier. Obviously, we have network security. That's really where I spend most of my time talking to network security folks. The VM, the server security folks as well, right? We have cloud security. From a Cisco perspective, we look at cloud security a couple of different ways. We look at this mainly in terms of our umbrella product, the former OpenDNS. And so we do see in large organizations, these are separate. So we'll see a kind of a core NetSec team. We'll see a cloud security team. And we see companies using these for different solutions, right? We'll see them using cloud security for outbound internet access. We'll see them using them for remote VPN access. Well, we'll see network security being, if they are still doing remote access in-house, we'll see it there, as well as IPS. So usually different teams with different use cases, even from a security perspective. Cloud native security, the DevSecOps team. This is relatively new in terms of security. The problem, as I mentioned before, these teams, they want to do, I'm sure there's some DevSecOps people here. They want to do what's right from a security perspective, but don't always have the right budget and authority to make large-scale changes from an operational perspective. And so, organizational challenges. People, right? We talked about them. Processes. Each of these groups and large organizations has its own process. Sometimes there's a workflow manager like ServiceNow. They can help to optimize this. But as you move security through these different organizations, sometimes things get lost. Sometimes things ultimately don't end up as they should. And then technology, right? Everyone has their own subject matter expertise, whether it be Citrix F5, I don't know why we have that. We're Cisco, we should have our name up there. Or you're looking at Oracle or Kubernetes, et cetera. These technology expertise also sometimes leads to breakdown in communication, right? One group, like I said, may have the right intention, but may not be speaking ultimately the right language. All right, so now I'm going to talk through what I call the anatomy of a breach. And I've been doing this for a long time. We've had different slides that kind of show this. But at the end of the day, this is actually a new one that I got for my team. But it ultimately remains the same, right? I mean, this is, if you read any papers out there from the NSA, from any security organization, it's really all the same. A user is going to be compromised, right? They're going to be compromised through, usually one of two methods. A lot of what we see today, quite frankly, is via social engineering. Either they'll call and say they're a help desk, or they'll call and say they're, some IT person that needs a username and password. We've actually seen, if you read the news, we've seen some hacks into MFAs as well, getting users to actually do an MFA push in order to authenticate them, even though their device has already been hacked, giving that hacker user access into the network. So once they get in, these hackers will move laterally, right? And this is where microsegmentation comes in. The ability to limit what we call the blast radius or lateral movement is key to keeping the hackers, quite frankly, at bay. And so this can happen a number of different ways in terms of lateral movement. Sometimes they'll move laterally as an individual user. What we see from some nation states is that they will actually try to gain admin credentials. Once they're in the network, once they gain those admin credentials, they're able to escalate privileges. Once they can escalate privileges, then they pretty much have the keys to the kingdom. Once they're in, moving laterally, they will then do one of two things. Encryption is the big one. That's what we hear about the most, right? Ransomware, this is the numbers I was talking about before, the 1.4 million, $10 million per year. They'll encrypt servers, they'll encrypt data. After they do the encryption, they'll want Bitcoin, or maybe not Bitcoin anymore. I don't know how they get paid, but depending on the price of Bitcoin, maybe you have to do more, maybe you have to do less. But we hear a lot about this publicly around municipalities, right? So-and-so city was hacked, so-and-so school district was hacked. Let me tell you, there's a lot more going on than that. It just doesn't make the news, right? There's a large corporation that we talked to, this is about 2 years ago now, that actually had to tear down their whole server infrastructure. I mean, we're talking hundreds of millions of dollars of server infrastructure because they didn't pay the ransom fee and the hackers got in. I can't tell you the story because it'll probably give away who it was. But what I will say, it came through a USB drive. And so I was a little bit nervous about giving my USB drive to the speakers over there, but I did it anyway. I haven't put it back on my computer since then. Maybe I'll erase it. But that's a common way to get in. The other thing that they do is they will exfiltrate data, right? And the types of data that we see exfiltrated are a couple different types of data. And the main one is really IP, right? Any sort of intellectual property that a company may have, any sort of sensitive financial records are certainly prime for exfiltration. Another story I'll tell is we have a customer who's a hospital, and they actually take care of some senators, some congressmen. And anytime these senators and congressmen happen to go into the hospital, there's a number of nation states that want to know, quite frankly, what the prognosis of a certain senator is, right? And so keeping nation states, keeping the hackers out is certainly critically important. So the takeaway from this slide, right? People are going to get into the network. It's going to happen. I mean, I'm sure everyone here knows of a breach in their company or a friend's company that's happened. But what we're really trying to do, like I said, is limit that blast radius. So if you look at it from the encryption piece, right? If we can limit the number of lines that are going around, they could encrypt less. They could do less damage in terms of ransomware. If we limit where they can go to get sensitive information, quite frankly, we can limit the information they have access to. And so I've seen cases where we know that hackers are active in networks, but with the right controls, we're actually able to contain them into a certain part of the network and then remediate, right? Very effective strategy. I've seen it real time, and it works very, very well. All right. Now we're going to talk about zero trust architecture and the NIST 800-207 standard. And so for those of you that are not familiar with NIST, it's really a security governing body that puts out, really the top level security documents out there in terms of how companies should ultimately look at security, right? And so when we look at zero trust architecture, we really look at two pieces. We look at the data plane, which is, you see here, you got a user, you got a system. It's untrusted because there's zero trust. We have policy enforcement points. This could be a number of different things. This could be a firewall. This could be, secure workload. It could be anything that is actually enforcing policy, even NAC for that, from that perspective. And then ultimately the resources. And then what do we need in order to actually fully distribute this zero trust policy? Well, we need a policy engine and a policy administrator, right? So we need to be able to instantiate a policy based upon this user, their system, and what they're trying to get access to. And finally, we need to be able to share this contextual information, right? In the security world, we talk a lot about context. We talk about, it's not just, and again, I'm on the firewall side, I'm on the workload side. It's not just what my products can see, it's about what other information I can get from, the main one that we get is threat intelligence, right? We get a threat intelligence feed, and from there, we're able to take action. I can tell you we have a customer, a university, when Log4j came out, they were telling us that actually their firewall knew about Log4j before them, right? Because we were able to push a Log4j alert to them, and they had the right policy enabled, and they were actually able to block Log4j exfiltrations or I should say attacks. And so threat intelligence is of critical importance. We have one of the best threat intelligence groups out there. They're called Talos. They're working 24/7 to make sure that we're good. Anyway, I was going to mention the elections and some of the things that we saw there, but I'll leave that for, catch me at the bar later. I'll tell you about that one. What else? So SIMs, right? Identity management, PKI, all of this, very important. Looking at a more holistic security solution, right? Again, it's not point products. It's how do we share context? How do we take context into systems? How do we share context out of systems to be able to make the right security decisions? So when we overlay this with secure workload, this is how it looks, right? And so we have the same distributed enforcement data plane on the bottom, and we have a centralized control policy on top. And so one of the critical things, and I talked about this earlier, is really around visibility, right? And so how do we get visibility into what those systems are talking to, how they're interacting with those policy enforcement points, and what they're actually doing on the network? 2 is context. Just talked about this one, right? How do we share that context? How do we ingest context to give the users of secure workload and, quite frankly, secure firewall better information about their security controls? The 3rd is policy discovery. And this is an interesting one, and what I think one of the most powerful pieces of secure workload. I apologize to take a drink here real quick. I was told I had to use this AWS a water bottle. Hope everyone got one, so we can save some treats, I guess. So I poured it from my other water bottle into that water bottle. Anyway, policy discovery. So here what we're trying to do, what we are doing is we're looking at what applications are out there in the network and what do we think that policy is supposed to be, right? So we know that we have an app. We know that it's talking to, let's say, let's say it's talking to a TFTP server. I'm just going to throw some things out there. We'll say it's going to talk to a finance server. Maybe it has to talk to some sort of streaming server, right? So we're able to look at everything it's doing, and then we're actually able to model a policy. That's the policy analytics piece to say, hey, does this application actually talking to what it's supposed to be talking to? And if we see violations in that policy, we're able to send a flag and say, hey, we've now seen this application, talk to the HR server, and it's not supposed to. And as I mentioned before around visibility, looking at what those applications are and what they're talking to, modeling a policy based upon those communication paths, and then finally, enforcing the policy, right? And so when we get to step 5, that's when we truly get to true microsegmentation. But again, you got to go through steps 1, 2, 3, 4, ultimately in order to get there. Very powerful. We actually, our biggest microsegmentation customer is internal. It's actually WebEx, although we started rolling them out about 4 or 5 months ago, and we have about 50,000 workloads that we're monitoring from them right now, and we'll go up to 200,000 workloads. And so it's been very, very powerful for WebEx. They're able to understand the communication paths between these applications. They're able to monitor those paths and, quite frankly, able to enforce those communications and security policies between those different applications. All right. So then once we are able to enforce, we can, of course, do that. Let me go back. Across hosts, across clouds, and across, ultimately, the network. So we'll talk now about securing hybrid environments. So one of the interesting things, and I'm sure all of you out there have applications that reside on-prem as well as in the cloud, what we can do is we can take the same policies that we have on-prem today and actually migrate those into cloud workloads, right? And so if you have a secure workload deployed on-prem, you're monitoring applications there, we can move that same level of control ultimately up into public cloud and cloud environments. And we can do this both, and I think the next 2 slides, we'll talk about secure firewall integration. This is very powerful as what it allows us to do. We've modeled that policy, we've applied that policy in secure workload, and then we could share that policy with a firewall, right? And so not only do we know the east-west communication paths, but we can also model north-south communication as well. Log data, this can be in a number of different places, right? You can log straight to an S3 bucket. You can log to a SIEM. Our in-house product is Secure Analytics, which is SAL, which you can log to there as well. All right. So we'll talk a little bit about how we secure public cloud workloads. And so really what we're doing is we're looking at security group policies that are managed and programmed, right, by a secure workload. These policies can be adapted, certainly based upon the security group capabilities. And it also, we can do agentless policy discovery analysis and enforcement as well. One of the things that we do in a secure firewall is we actually, and workload as well, is we actually have connectors into AWS, right? And so as these VPCs or VNets or security groups are coming up, we can ingest them into our policy, and we can apply either a known policy to those, or we can instantiate new policies to them as well. Some of the kind of key takeaways from this, right? And what we're trying to do is to bring this into a centralized UI, right? And so this cloud onboarding and management workflow, right? The single onboarding wizard to make it easier to enable integration capabilities, right? Automate, ultimately, when necessary. And give that option to auto-create scopes. This is what I talked about before, based upon VPC or VNet as a part of that workflow, right? So not having to recreate the wheel. You know this, again, maybe it's a new finance application. You have this set policy for finance. You can apply it to that new VPC or VNet. And then ultimately a single UI to monitor the status and the details and integration. And so, for us, it's around really 2 things. How do we apply policy? And then ultimately, how do we make sure we have the right analytics to ensure that the policy has been instantiated correctly. We'll talk about agent and agentless protection here for a second. This is something relatively new for us on the secure workload side. I believe it was in the 3.6 or 3.7 release that just came out. And so just kind of a little background. There's two ways in which we can do application visibility today. One is we actually have to put an agent on, whether it be a server or a workload or on a container, to monitor the transactions that are taking place. The other way we can do that is agentless, which gives us a little bit less flexibility in terms of security, but allows much quicker time to value. And so for those of you out there that are potentially looking at this today, again, been doing this for a while, one of the things that I've seen is agentless, and we offer this, by the way. Agentless is good if you have a CISO, if you have a director of IT or director of network security that wants to see value come out very, very quickly, right? They want to show that they've delivered something. Agentless is the way to go. But what we tend to see is once people have agentless in place, they'll ultimately move to an agent-based deployment, right? And why is that? It's really around granular security controls, right? And so I can provide much more granularity in terms of the policies that I want on that application using an agent. Both are good. Agentless, quicker time to value. Quite frankly, agentless quicker time to value in an agent provides a lot more security. It really kind of depends on where you are in your application journey. We build this one out. I think there's one more there. OK. So this is how it works, right? We have dynamic policy that we can leverage via secure workload. We talked about this earlier, visibility and control. That's what we call dynamic policy. We suck up NetFlow records from the firewall. And so that's that NCEL line you see there between secure firewall threat defense and the workload. We send those NetFlow records to secure workload. The firepower threat defense is actually the physical or virtual hardware. From there, we then can connect through into the Firepower Management Center, and that's the FMC, that's our management center, right? And so what we're seeing on the firewall and sending into workload is those flows from a specific application. So we can, and usually where we see this is around vulnerability management. So we may want to, isolate a certain server that has, known vulnerabilities that aren't going to be patched for whatever reason, right? So we can segment out those particular machines into their own zone and not allow basically anyone to access them. On the agent side, I should say, this is typical what you see, right? I have the ability to look at L2, L3, L4 policies and provide that east-west segmentation there. All right, we'll talk about steps to application segmentation. As I mentioned before, this is certainly a journey, and we'll talk through some of that. So first step, right? Prioritize the applications. For those of you who are looking to move down this route, how do you prioritize which applications that you'd like to have visibility and/or policy on, right? The next step, once you have a good understanding of those applications, gain the visibility, right? Place the agent, do agentless, whichever you choose. From there, understand the basically communication patterns of those different applications. Develop a policy. This is usually somewhat of a longer step. The next 3 steps are usually a little bit longer. So what do you actually want this application to talk to? Do you want it to talk, full access control in the network? Do you want to look at specific pieces or specific other applications that it needs to talk to? Develop those policies, and then simulate the policy. We talked about this before. You have a policy, you've simulated this policy, you're monitoring but not enforcing what this application is talking to, right? If you see discrepancies in that policy, you can modify and edit those policies to make the changes, and/or you potentially have found an anomaly in the network. Next, enforce the policy, right? Actually push enforcement down. This is the button, right, that if you haven't done your homework in steps 1 through 4 there, you're going to get some help desk calls. But that's why we allow customers like yourselves to make their way through this journey, right? To not have to flip the switch immediately, and that's where I really think the simulate policy is a very powerful tool. And then finally, implement and monitor operate and automate the policies. And we talked a little bit about this earlier. How do I look at the policy? How do I automate it in a way that, again, if I see new finance, VPCs come up, if I see new HR VPCs come up, right, I can take the policy that I have and ultimately apply it to that. So secure workload in a nutshell, and after this we'll talk about users. One, telemetry, right? This is around telemetry of what apps are out there, where are these apps communicating to, and what they should and should not be talking to. Two, the context. Again, we talked about this as well, right? Whether it be sending context to third parties or receiving context from third parties to make sure the security policy is doing ultimately what it is designed to do. Setting the policy, and then finally pushing that enforcement. And so, as we look at application security, we know that it continues to evolve. At Cisco, we want to stay in front of those trends, making sure that we can provide application security no matter where applications ultimately end up. All right, so what about the user? Well, I know you came here to talk about application policy, but no policy conversation would be complete unless we talked about the users. And so earlier we talked around multiple different people in the organization that had to push policy across multiple different systems, right? And so what we want to do is have a central place that we can set rules to connect to, no matter how you connect or what you access and what you can and can't do, right? And then propagate these rules across multiple enforcement points. These enforcement points, again, could be the secure workload product that I spoke about. It could be firewalls. It could be user agents. It doesn't matter. Populating those policies independent of where those enforcement points are. All right. We also want to be able to leverage telemetry to define these policies through intent. All right. All right. So here's a typical policy, right? We want to allow Maria to access enterprise applications like Salesforce and Gainsight, right? But not only that, we only want to allow her to do that when she's working on a Mac or an iPad, and moreover, if she's in the United States, right? So this is a very easy policy. Anyone can understand this. I could take this to my mother. She could figure this out, right? And we're trying to abstract, IP, for those of you that know firewalls, IP any, right? Permit, deny. We're trying to abstract those types of ACLs out and really make it more user-focused, right? What we also want to be able to do is that she should also be allowed access to personal financial systems, such as her Coinbase account, but we want to do it with remote browser isolation, right? So we want to make sure that when she is accessing Coinbase, there's no anomalies or nefarious activities taking place on that browser, and we can do it in a remote and secure way. And really what we're saying is we want this to be policy-driven, right, and intent-driven versus action-driven. Oh, okay. So here we're talking about using this technology and ingesting multiple pieces of telemetry data into an intelligent policy engine, right? A lot of this, if you look at where we've, at least from a Cisco perspective, where we've gone, the majority of our security tools today are in the cloud, right? And given that they're in the cloud in some form or fashion, we have that ability to look at different APIs, to be able to skin and reskin policies in a way that makes it very easy to provide the right level of policy independent of the underlying policy enforcement point, right? And so what we're saying is this unified agent, what we talk about really it's the old AnyConnect agent, right? It can check device security and posture and provide this policy engine with the ability to automatically set policy defaults based upon what it's seeing on an individual's, whether it be a laptop or an iPad. Then this policy would automatically be translated to set the right controls across multiple services in what we're calling the security cloud. And ultimately, the user and organization would know that the security cloud is securing their session and providing high levels of security and resiliency. I don't have a lot on threat detection and response, but I was talking to, again, one of my colleagues, and we tend to look at security, again, as this continuum. We used to use a framework that was like before, during, and after, right? And really before is how do I set policies? How do I keep the attackers out of my network? During is what happens during an attack. We talked a little bit, as I mentioned before, on Log4j. We can look at threat intelligence. We can understand what we can block. But detection and response is really around what happens after a breach, right? And so having the right level of logs, having the right level of information to understand what has happened is key to any incident response organization. And so our threat intelligence platform is called SecureX. Here we're saying, right, you have the SecOps administrator, which is, again, incident response. They have access into this engine that allow us to take better actions in case of a breach. Don't need to say this, but I will. I think this slide builds one more time, right? Is part of the security cloud vision that we have, making sure that we're open, right? Having the right level of APIs, having the right level of integrations. We know at Cisco, we don't see every event that happens out there, every security anomaly that's out there. And so, getting information from third parties, whether it be, CDNs, right? Web application, DDoS attacks. We have, partners we work with there. Ingesting that information and sharing information is ultimately going to be critical. And then finally, a frictionless experience, right? One of the things as we're kind of pivoted away from application access and talking more about users here, but independent of where a user is located, right? Are they, connected via SD-WAN? Are they connected directly into AWS? Are they connected into the internet via, Xfinity or Cox? It really shouldn't matter how they connect, right? What matters is we provide that right level of security for them ultimately once they are connecting. And this is my final slide, which we'll talk about today. So Cisco and AWS Control Tower. And so this is what we'll be announcing here, and what is it, right? And so what we're looking to do is take kind of best practice firewall configurations and have them available as customers are deploying secure firewall via AWS Control Tower, right? So you see there, right, save time deploying security and networking infrastructure in AWS. And what we think this will do is help organizations with onboarding to cloud more securely and then unifying this policy across our infrastructure. And so you can take these pre-canned configs, you can potentially take configs you've worked on on-prem, and then move them very seamlessly into the cloud. And one of the things we do see is organizations or groups in organizations are migrating to the cloud, but they actually don't want to build that network from scratch, right? And so what we're doing is we're saying we're going to take a template-based design mechanism, if you will, and use that to offer these products as part of the AWS service catalogs. We think this will allow organizations the networking environment security they need to securely migrate applications and data in one click. So take a look at this. It's on the show floor. Super powerful, something we're very proud to be able to be partnered with AWS on. And with that, enjoy the rest of the show.